Greetings. You know, I actually wrote out a really excellent introduction, but I can't find it. So if Nate Morgan, if you're in the audience, it was sometime when I was meeting with you this morning, I had all my crap. I had my book bag, it was filled with stuff. I had my laptop, it was filled with stuff. I looked at my Google Calendar, it was filled with stuff. I got a new phone, so I can't quite figure it out. I thought it was on my Google Docs. And at this time in the year, I don't know how many of you feel like it, but I feel like just throwing it all away. So I was in Kroger the other night, which is a grocery store, if you haven't gone there, and they had this issue of Real Simple magazine. And I thought, maybe if I just got Real Simple magazine, I could simplify my life. Or if I could get a really good IKEA shelf. I don't think there is such a thing as a really good IKEA shelf, but just imagine that. So I would be really well organized, and I would have Real Simple magazine, and all my priorities would be clear. And then I started remembering this book that I had read. It's called The Boxman by Kobo Abe. And those of you studying architecture or sculpture or anything dealing with people in space, it's 1973, a guy leaves his crappy job and puts a cardboard box over his head and effectively escapes from society. What does your escape look like when you can get rid of all your obligations and sort of free yourself? Ultimately, this boxman retreats from the world and becomes kind of invisible until he finds love in a society filled with other people who are seeking the same type of escape. In about the mid-90s, Andrea Zittel started making what she called A to Z living units that focused on the most basic needs of food and shelter, and they could be contained by her rather small 200-square-foot Brooklyn apartment. And they looked, I'd say, like a really good IKEA shelf or a late modernist construction that pared things down as minimally as possible. That same impulse is something that's like American transcendentalists like Henry David Thoreau believed in, that if we could pare down to the basic essentials, we could come into contact with the things that were most meaningful. So Thoreau was sort of most famous for leaving the hustle and bustle of mid-19th century Concord, Massachusetts, and walking a few miles outside and building his cabin at Walden Pond. And there in that Spartan cabin, he tried to decide on how many chairs he should have. 1, he said, is for solitude, 2 is for companionship, and 3 is for society. As Andrea Zittel's practice moved physically and psychologically in some ways from that small apartment in Brooklyn to a 25-acre parcel in the California desert, she continues to address some of those questions about simplicity and what our desires are for nomadism and mobility, and that by creating what is effectively a 21st century idealistic commune, we recognize in some ways that by escaping from all the trappings of our hustle and bustle, what we do is come into contact with one another in some of the most profound social interactions. Please join me in welcoming Andrea Zittel.
See if I can do this without toppling everything over. Hi, thank you so much for coming. Okay, I can't see, okay, good. I just wanted to see who is here and what you guys look like, thank you. And I know it's raining outside, so thanks for coming, and thanks for those really great introductions. Okay, I get super, super nervous when I start this, and then it gets better, so I just kind of have to start. From October 30th to November 7th, 1999, I had one of the most incredible experiences of my life. For a project called Free-Running Rhythms and Patterns in an Isolated Human Subject, I lived for 1 week without access to external time. I conducted this experiment in a basement studio in Berlin that had been sealed off from all sources of light and sound. In order to find out what patterns my day-to-day life would fall into, I used a time-lapse recorder which had been set to play for 168 hours, the length of a week. At the end of 168 hours, the recorder was supposed to click off so that I would know the experiment was over. These are some of the cameras that were hooked up to the recorder. I've always been really interested in how constructed our perception of time is. People talk about physical structures like environments and architecture as controlling us, but the invisible element of time, which wasn't even measured or recorded until the 13th century, is an even more rigid and pervasive system of social control. The first time that I became interested in time was actually way back when I was a kid, and this was pre-internet, pre-Wikipedia, but my parents had multiple sets of Encyclopedia Britannicas. And I remember, I would just sort of read through them, different articles, and there was this one article where they would talk about how they would take subjects of scientific studies on circadian rhythms, and they would put them into caves to see what sort of natural sleeping and waking patterns would emerge. This is so hard. This is like the condensed version of my talk, so I only have an hour. And so there's some really interesting things that came up in that, including the fact that the natural circadian rhythm is actually, oh God, it's like an hour off. It said there are 23 hours or 25 hours, but it's not 24 hours, which is like a whole other thing to get into about what's natural. But the thing that I thought about the most, like ever since reading those, is like those studies spoke about what the objective sort of analysis of living about time was, but they never spoke about what the subjective experience was. And that's the thing that I always wondered about, like what would it actually feel like to live without time? And what I found from my own personal experiment was that I could create this really incredibly extreme experience with these really, really minimal means. I mean, I didn't get rid of time, I just shifted my understanding of it. And then the other thing about this experiment that kind of comes up repeatedly in my work is this really fine line between freedom and restriction. I'm super interested in how these are two things that we think are in opposition to each other, but they actually relate very closely, and sometimes one can turn into the other. But in this case, I was emancipated through the introduction of a set of limitations. And then, of course, there's the story behind the story, which I have a bunch of these, and so I'll hopefully not tell you all of them, but this one's kind of good. So this is the kitchen, and so at a certain point into the experiment, I ran out of food. And I had my time-lapse recorder, it was a German machine, and so I had a German assistant who set it up for me because I couldn't read the instructions. And we didn't test it ahead of time because I didn't have enough time to test it for a whole week. And so I started to worry, and I started to worry that maybe what had happened was that it had just gone into some continuous loop, because I didn't know for sure if it was going to work that it would shut off. And so for a while it was okay, because I actually also had brought a ton of beer into the space with me, thinking that if it was a really bad experience, I could drink my way through it. So I knew I had enough calories to survive, and I remember doing things like turning my ketchup into a soup. And so I cheated at the very end, and I plugged my phone into the wall, and I called my friend Mike Ballou, who was doing a residency at the same time there, and I said, Mike, don't tell me what time it is, don't tell me anything, just say yes or no, is it after midnight on Saturday? And he said, no. And then I said, okay. I said, I'm doing that thing I told you about, and there's a key buried under the rock at the top of the stairs, and will you come get me at midnight so I know for sure that that's when it is, and will you bring me food because I'm out of food? And then Mike said, I'm sorry, I can't because I have a date. And then I cried, and then he showed up with Chinese food at midnight. And he said I looked really funny when he got there. His theory was that there wasn't enough oxygen down there. But anyway, I wanted to start my talk with this project because it's one of the most profound experiences in my life. It's probably also one of my favorite pieces that I've ever done, and it frames a condition in my work that I have not been able to resolve yet, that I always think about. It's really important for me that my art results in some sort of experience, but I'm trying to figure out if it's enough to have that experience for myself, or if not, then how to translate or create an experience for a larger audience, And so I think that the sort of quick answer to that is that art's a form of communication, it's for an audience. Well, that's true, but and I know we're not supposed to use the word authentic, so maybe somebody will tell me a better word, but for lack of a better word, it's like, when you create any kind of experience for a large number of people, I feel like it loses that unmediated sense. You already know what's going to happen, it's been planned, and I'm just really interested in things that you don't know, that anything could happen. And so I feel like I find myself continually setting up situations like that. Just to kind of quickly go over this solution, because I do have this sort of like this gallery practice in addition to like these experiments that I do. So the solution that I came up with in terms of presenting this piece for a show is I made this installation of wall panels that represent the timeline of my week without time. I looked at the video recordings and I figured out all the different activities that I did during the week. I think there's a closer image of them so you can see how it's like each kind of line is a day of the week, and then each, like, you know, it's a different time. So I could kind of trace my patterns. I really wanted to see if my normal patterns would completely fall apart or not. And then, you know, I've always wanted to make time tunnels. For like for a show, you know, so when you get invited to do a show, they always say, well, what are your ideas? And so for years and years and years, I'd always say, oh, I want to make these time tunnels, and we'll make them in the museum, and people can go in them. Anybody can go in them, and they can stay in as long as they want, and when they won't know what time it is, and then they'll come out, which you clearly can't do within an institution, because if it's closed and there are no security guards around, you can't have people wandering around the museum. So I started just making all these models of like what they would look like and what would happen in them. So this is time to read every book I ever wanted to read. There was one that was time to get into perfect shape, time to get to know people better, and then my favorite one was time to do nothing productive at all. This talk is like super out of chronological order. So we're in the late 1990s right now, same time as the time trials experiment I showed you. And I'm going to just show you a couple of pieces from the late 1990s. And at this point, like even though my work was being curated into exhibitions, it was really important to me that the projects contained some sort of experimental lived situation. So the A to Z pocket property is a 54-ton concrete island that was built in the body of water between Sweden and Denmark. The inspiration for the island was my own home culture of Southern California, a culture which is particularly sensitized to issues of personal space. And there's always this large emphasis placed on owning private property and things like homes and cars and land, you know, which is also difficult because our population is growing so quickly. So entire towns out there can be created in a matter of months, often by a single developer. When I was working on the island, I sometimes fantasized that when all of the land had been built up, this would be, you know, a product that could be mass-produced, and then there would be communities of islands like this one kind of marching off the coast into the Pacific Ocean. I think it's also worth mentioning that at the time that I made these, I was a really big science fiction fan, and I really love the way that science fiction embeds social commentary in this narrative, and it takes it to it takes existing conditions and then it kind of magnifies them to create this logical yet super extreme future scenario, which in many instances actually do end up playing out. I've worked with islands several times in my work, and I'm really drawn to that, the image of the island. I think in our culture, it's come to represent a kind of individualism or personal autonomy, you know, almost as if it's a country of its own, and then the occupant's the ruler who's in charge of his life and everything in his domain. And even though I fantasize about living alone and having total autonomy over my life all the time, I'm also really conscious of the fact that the structure of isolation, as well as the illusion of individualism, can actually make us more passive, and it mitigates a lot of our power as a collective. So I feel like I have a love-hate relationship with these things that I'm totally drawn to. And the island took 2 years to build. When it was finally completed, I went to live on it for a summer, which was pretty intense. I think that my idea of what this would be and the experience of it were really different. For instance, I imagined like floating around on my own private island, like, you know, like out in this body of water in Scandinavia, and how lovely that would be. And it was like super stormy and cold the entire time. And it's not, I wish, like it's not in this photo, but kind of right in front of where this bed is, we had this ingenious idea to make a cooler. So, you know, you could put things like milk and eggs. Basically, we cut a hole, and I thought I'd drop everything down in a net, and then I wouldn't have to have a cooler with ice in it. And after we cut the hole, what happened is that every time the island would drop down on the water, like this big blowhole, like a geyser would pop up inside of it. And it became evident to, I guess I also thought that maybe they'd let me keep the island, and so I'd have my own private island when the project was finished, and then, you know, we started talking about how that would work and who would be responsible for it, and we realized that that was like, not gonna work out. And it became really, it was just so big, like nobody wanted to take responsibility for it, so, and you can't ship it anywhere. And so I ended up shooting a film on it with a Danish artist named Joachim Hamu, who I'd met while I was working on it. And so these are just some pictures when we were shooting on the film. The guy on the left, his name's Paul, and he was a carpenter, so he was helping do some work on the island, but he was also one of the characters in our film. And I always like this photo because when I took at it, he was sort of glaring at me, like showing me his scraped up knees, saying, "Your island bit me." And then the guys on the right were some of the people from the film crew. I feel incredibly uncomfortable with the video, though. I've never shown it anywhere because it's so excruciatingly painful to see myself in the video. But it was fun shooting it. That's Joachim in the middle. The experimental living situations that I just showed you were coming out of a practice of making art within the context of my own day-to-day life. So now I'm going to kind of go backward to the early 1990s. This is right after I got out of school. And I moved to New York right after finishing my MFA at RISD. I went through kind of quickly because I didn't know what I was going to do with my life, and staying in school was the easiest thing. And so I got out and I moved to New York, and I had really super insane student loans, and it was the beginning of the really gnarly recession. Like, I know there was a recession recently that didn't really seem to affect anyone, and the market's stronger than ever, but in the 90s it was really bad, and like all the artists that I looked up to when I was in school, like their galleries were closing, and you know, they were having to go back and get day jobs. So it was like a weird time to be moving into the art world as a young artist, but in retrospect, I think it was like kind of the best time too. So I rented this little storefront, and it was, I don't know, I think it was like $350 a month. But what happened is, I think because, you know, I wasn't thinking about trying to like get a gallery, and I inadvertently wound up with this space that was inherently public. It really made me realize how empowering it was to have my own space, you know, and I was able to just make my work, and when I felt like I needed an audience, I could kind of, you know, open up my doors and show it to people. And then when I eventually did start working with commercial galleries, I never really gave up this way of working as well, and I feel like it was always really empowering in those relationships because, you know, it was like a facet of my practice, but it wasn't the only way that I made work. The space was 200 square feet, and it was made up of 2 rooms. Each room was 10 feet by 10 feet each. When I think about that now, it's so crazy, but at the time, it just seemed normal. And I was breeding animals as my artwork in the front room, and that, like, the whole breeding project is like a whole, probably, talk in itself. So, and then, let's see. Okay, so in the back room, I was building habitats that my animals lived in, and eventually I started to become conscious of the organization of my own life. So originally I had the desk on the back wall, and I had this IKEA cot that kind of slid under the desk, so I was half sleeping under my desk, and then that was about it. And I had chickens and quails and flies and a huge Weimaraner, like a huge 80-pound dog, all in here with me. And I was making these really beautiful kind of streamlined modernist breeding units for my animals, and I looked at them and I realized that like their lives seemed like their environment seemed nicer than my own, so I thought I'd try and make something similar for myself. I call it my management and maintenance unit. So this was the very beginning, and I gridded off the wall to see how much space was needed for everything. The desk doubled as a desk and a table. The plastic sinks that you see also doubled as a bathtub, so I'd take baths in the sink. And then the toilet was right behind the sink. That's like a little wall that kind of comes out. And then this top platform was actually the bottom of my bed, so there was a loft bed on top of it. And then once I figured out like a format that worked, my friend who was welding the structures for my animal environments, like he welded this up and remade these sort of wooden inserts that went into everything. So this was my own personal management and maintenance unit. And initially I viewed this as a personal project. At the time I really didn't see it as part of my art practice. Since I had to move every 6 months and I had very little control over the environments that I lived in, my goal was to make a unit that could create a sense of permanence and stability, kind of like a house that would go inside of the houses that other people owned. And then this was, well, okay, so this is actually one of the first shows I was in at Andrea Rose. It was the first show I was in at Andrea Rose in Gallery, where the person who I still show with now in New York. And I remember she came over to do a studio visit, and instead of talking about all my other work, the work with the chickens, we ended up sitting in here and like really talking about this the entire time. And then she asked me if I wanted to put it in the gallery. So this was kind of the beginning of transitioning into this work. One thing that I think it's worth pointing out, because it's probably hard to fathom now, was that this was the first time that I used the language of modern design in my works. And so when I grew up, modern design was considered like, that was weird. And there was only one modern house in our neighborhood, and that was like, the sort of, they were like the really eccentric family, the modern house. But it was before things like dwell or design within reach sort of brought this to the masses. And I've always liked environments and furniture, and grew up with boats and camper vans and stuff. But with my money, I would collect like arts and crafts furniture. So that my kind of coming around point to modernism was that I became really interested in its ability to manipulate and invert codes of what was considered good design. So before modern design, people would, for instance, use white paint if they were poor and they couldn't afford pigments. But modernism elevated the color of white to a status of moral purity. And structures that were simple and functional looking weren't considered beautiful until early modern architects started finding inspiration in things like American industrial grain silos, which they then transcribed back on to like designs for living in Europe, which were then sort of imported back to the States as like, European modern design. So it's kind of funny how these things cycle. But it really appeals to me in the way that it inverts values, social codes, and ideologies. There's like this, I'm kind of, as I talk to you, I'm like weighing, okay, I'm gonna say it because if I spend too long thinking about it, I'll just waste more time. But if you think about the Industrial Revolution, like that was super interesting because it was the first time, before like, like sort of elite, like objects of status either became that because they had a lot of handwork or sort of expensive materials in them. And then the Industrial Revolution happened and it was like, okay, you can have these sort of fine goods for everyone. And it's so telling to me that this is the moment when this sort of intellectual elite or like this, created this new moral code about what was considered good design and what wasn't, And so it was like in my mind, it was like this kind of whole new way of thinking about things. And values became much more abstract and ephemeral and interesting. But back to like the way that it applied to my life, and the reason I thought that was really interesting because I was young, I was poor, I didn't have many possessions, and I definitely couldn't live the way that other people did. But I could use visual design, like the language of it, to kind of glamorize my life and make other people wish that they could live like I did. So it was kind of like turning my liberations into limitations. In 1994, I moved to a small row house in Brooklyn. I'd managed to buy the building and I started to turn it in, there's like, just so you know, like so things were, well, there was like one other place I lived between what I showed you and this, but like this was still the recession. And despite what everyone thinks, I think that recessions are really good for artists sometimes. And I actually got this building for $120,000, which was kind of amazing. And so owning a building really changed things for me because I could do anything I wanted with it. And owning a building that was so cheap was really liberating because, you know, it really changed. I don't know, I guess I felt like I didn't have to worry about, it's not that I didn't want to damage my building, but it wasn't like, you know, I wasn't going to destroy my property value or anything. And I decided to turn it into a showroom testing ground for my work. And I decided that I would make prototypes for experimental furniture, live with them, and then when I needed a change, I'd sell one set of furniture and move on to the next. This is the home office. I also thought a lot, I thought a lot about the division between public and private, which is this kind of historical construction. If you trace architecture back, or even the notion of privacy in Western culture didn't really exist until very recently. And I thought that the idea of completely merging them all, so basically my home office was an extension of my bedroom, and I did these personal experiments that weren't really turned into official pieces, but I did this experiment for a while where I had these pajamas that I would wear 24 hours a day. There's another piece I'll show you in a few minutes that's kind of from that time period. So yeah, I was just like sort of trying to invert all of these different things that wouldn't normally be conflated together. This is the kitchen where I made my A to Z food group. I'm pretty healthy, I hate to cook. And then ever since doing my work with domestic animals, I've been interested in the commercially prepared foods that I feed my animals. And you know, the way that it contains all of the basic nutrients that they need to stay alive in this very easy to prepare mixture. So I decided that I wanted to develop a similar food for myself, and I used a dehydrator, and I just started dehydrating all the different foods I thought I should be eating, and I made them into this food group mix that you could eat raw, or you could cook it into patties, or make it into soup. The Ottoman furniture, this is one of the first kinds of furniture I made when I moved in. And the idea was they'd come as a set of 12 and you could use them for all functions, from sleeping on to a low table to sleeping. Oh, this is the one. These were the pajamas I used to wear. This is the pit bed. I remember being really concerned after a while that my furniture wasn't comfortable enough. And after looking at really comfortable pieces of furniture, I decided that furniture that your body kind of goes into, you know, like my friends would have these large kind of plaid polyester sofas that were super comfortable, that you would sink into, that kind of furniture was inherently more comfortable than the furniture that your body goes on top of, like the Ottomans. So this was my prototype for an inside of furniture. And so like I mentioned, I was kind of trying to put different things together. So like this, I would socialize this in the daytime and then sleep in it in the nighttime. I had these two comforters, and they would go in the cubbies, and then pillows in the other cubbies. And so at nighttime, I'd pull the comforters out and sleep on top of one and under the other one. And then, okay, well, I don't have slides of it, but just to test it, I ended up, because it was an experiment, like I made the same shape. I made this round disc piece of furniture that was plush and upholstered, and I lived for equal amounts of time with the inside of furniture and the on top of furniture. And the consensus was that the inside of furniture was more comfortable, but it was also a little bit claustrophobic, and the on top of furniture was less comfortable, but it was sort of more liberating, which I think sort of is always that with everything. I mean, those values always seem to go together. And the bathroom. My assistant was also a bartender at one of Robert De Niro's restaurants in Tribeca. So we made this bar. This is the ground floor of the storefront. We called it Dan's Desk. And my house was in Williamsburg. It's a part of Brooklyn that now is like super trendy, but it was considered really remote in the 1990s. Like it was hard to get people to come across the bridge to Brooklyn. And so on Thursday evenings, we would do these cocktail hour open houses and serve free cocktails to friends who were willing to make the trip, or just to people who are in the neighborhood. And I also have done this thing where we use, since the early 90s, I've only used bowls for all of my sort of eating and drinking functions. So we would make cocktails in the A to Z container, and people could drink them and walk around and see various prototypes in use in the house. And we also made the newsletter that you can see on the bulletin board. It was called the A to Z Personal Profiles, and I would interview people who were making the work or write little profiles about people who had purchased my work and were living in it, and we would send 100 out for each issue. So I had a mailing list that was mostly people who owned my work, but sometimes people I admired or just felt an affinity with. This is one of my favorite pieces of furniture. It's called a bofa, and it's a cross between a box and a sofa. Okay, so this kind of jumps back to the living unit, to the early 90s. For the images in these slides, the uniform series was another personal experiment that ended up becoming part of a larger project. I worked at a gallery at the time and was expected to look good every day, but finding appropriate clothing to wear became more and more of a chore. And I started to think a lot about how the demand for variety was actually more oppressive than continuity. For instance, like there's all these social stigmas about wearing the same thing every day, and I was trying to figure out like what that would connote. And at the time, I remember thinking that if you wore something 2 days in a row, it would mean that you were out partying and you didn't go home that night. Or people think that you were dirty, or, so, or you're poor, which, would be like a terrible thing for anyone to think, of course. So I decided that I'd make one dress that I really loved, and I'd wear that dress every day for 6 months. So that was the first dress on the left. It was a linen dress that, at the time, I thought that was like the best looking dress I could imagine. I was very happy with it. And that worked out great. So I started, I figured I would just keep doing it as long as it felt good. And the story with the linen dress too, it was during the gallery, this summer at the gallery. And so it was pretty slow there. We didn't have that many people coming in, but I did work with other people. And I always felt a little self-conscious. I didn't tell anyone I was doing it. And it was like the very second to last day of the experiment when my friend, who is the director, looked at me and she made this comment that stuck in my mind for a really long time. She said, "Didn't you wear that dress yesterday?" And I always wondered, was she just being facetious? Did it really take her that long to figure it out? And years later, I asked her and she said it really took her that long to figure it out. So then after that, I started doing it every 6 months. And it's really easy to wear the same thing every day when your brain is just sort of churning with the idea of what you're going to wear the next season. So I never really got bored because I was always doing drawings and fantasizing about the next season. And each garment, I think, kind of represented some personal fantasy, oh man, I just watched a bunch of Hal Hartley films that were super erotic but never had any sex, and so I thought, not having sex makes you cooler and more erotic than having sex, so I'm not gonna have sex for a year and I'm gonna dress like a nun. I mean, I was 22, 23, so that makes total sense. And so that was the next one over. And then after that, I was feeling super repressed, so I made this really sort of kind of hot silk dress that was slit way up, and I wore leggings under it, and then I could take the dress off and just work in my studio in the leggings. And then I had this sort of tough dress with these leather suspenders, and then the dress with the pants underneath, because I had my chickens on a rooftop coop at that point, and I would always have to go up a ladder when I did studio visits with people behind me. And then at the very end, what happened is I cycled through every single personal fantasy that I ever had, and having to go back to any of those again after doing it for 6 months just seemed super tragic. I was just really depressed. I didn't want to have to redo anything, and I had no new ideas. So there's all these things principles that I've learned in my work. And one of them is that rules make me more creative. And so I felt like I needed some rules to help me come up with new designs. And I often look at things I don't like when I want to get ideas. And so one thing, garment-wise, one thing that's always puzzled me a lot were Russian constructivist clothing. And I didn't particularly like it, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. And as I read more about it, I read that the reason that they make this really geometrical clothing is because they were concerned that fabric's woven in a rectangle, and that when you cut that into another shape and then sew it into yet another shape, you're completely adulterating the true nature of the fabric. And I really liked that. I mean, that made sense. So I just thought I would take that idea and push it to its kind of most logical, and yeah, I knew it was absurd, but I wanted to take it to its most logical extreme and only make clothing out of rectangles for as long as I could. So this was the first garment that I figured out, and so the way it works is that you actually put the back one on first. So you put one on the back, you put your arms to the straps, and then the other one goes on front, and you tie them both around the waist, so it's like a front and back that makes a full dress. And that worked really well. And so it just kind of turned into this like whole, I'm trying to remember how many years, but there were many years of the rectangles playing out. I wonder if I have, sorry, I'm gonna look forward. Oh, no, I didn't do it. Okay, I'll just describe it. There was like a point, maybe this brown dress is 1, 2, 3, 4 over from the left. There was even a point where I just started like tearing fabric from the bolt and like safety pinning it into a dress, which, coming back to the talk of values, it was a funny time because it was a time when high fashion was kind of mimicking that look, like Versace was using a bunch of safety pins. And I was getting ready to do a shot at the Prada Foundation, and they sent their curator over to meet me. And I was super broke back then and like living in a rundown shack with like a car that was up on blocks in the front yard. But as she met me at the airport, like she came up to me and she kept staring at my dress. And then she's like, "Who made that?" And she started guessing like all these designers. I just thought it was super funny because it was like really just like a $3 piece of fabric that had been safety pinned together. So I love it when that happens. And then, so eventually I tried to think how I could move forward without breaking the sort of rules that I'd set up with the rectangles. And I realized that I could crochet dresses because when you work with a strand, it's still a forward motion. Like you're not making one thing and turning it into something else. And I liked crocheting because you use one tool instead of like two, which would be knitting. So there were probably another 5 years of, I call these single strand uniforms. In the end, I got down to the point where I could crochet with my fingers, which is that one. So making what went on my body with my body. And then like the ultimate manifestation of that whole logic was felting, because felting, you're just using the raw material of the wool. And you make felt by like putting boiling water and soap on wool and rubbing it. And so it's like you can literally like make something that goes over your body with your body and no tools. And I figured out this way of making felt where you didn't have to sew it because I made it with this template. Like I took a shower curtain and made a template that would go inside of it, kind of like a pita pocket. And then you'd pull it out, and then I'd like shape it over a dress form. So those were really fun. Okay, so, oh man. In 1998, I fell in love and very spontaneously decided to pack everything up and move out to Los Angeles. And I'm so glad I took these pictures because there's so many things I haven't documented, but this was the reality of my life. This is the house that I lived in with my boyfriend. It was the total antithesis of my lifestyle in LA. So he was a fabricator, and because the garage wasn't very big, he'd sometimes build sculptures in the house for other people. So I think when I took these photos, he was building this really huge piece for Jason Rhodes, and he'd run out of room, and so he had like taken over the entire living room and dining room with this giant like car sculpture. So I've shown you how I was living and making work up until this point, and after this is the life that I moved into. So this total upheaval presented like this huge challenge because I realized that it would just be totally impossible to superimpose my old life onto my new life or to A to Z my boyfriend. And the period that followed was really tough because eventually I realized that my work before had always been this way of reconciling situations that I had no control over. And so I felt like I really needed to likewise create a new ideology that would help me embrace the situation that I was in now, but like nothing that I'd developed to this point. Like I had no tools for doing this anymore. Like nothing that I had figured out before would work in this situation, like especially not with another person. And I also was thinking that, my work before had always compensated for human imperfection, and I wanted my new work to embrace what I was starting to think of as human nature. So I had to embrace imperfection. So I started out with the ideology, and so I called the ideology raw, spelled R-A-U-G-H, and I just started making a list of how I wanted it to function. So, like number 2, so like my boyfriend was not fat, he was just big, and so basically any furniture we had broke, like quickly, and so I wanted to make things that would look good after they broke. And I don't, anyway, and you guys can, I think I have these available somewhere else too. So then I started looking around for like, okay, this is the ideology. What would this actually look like if it were to exist in the world? And so I started photographing. This is his ex-school friend's wolf dog who lived on a chain in the backyard because she ate cats, and we had cats. We had a bunch of dogs. We had 4 dogs, but Seika had to be on a chain part of the time, and so she would go out into the backyard every day and dig. She's with Zoe, with the Australian Shepherd in this picture, the black one. And they dig these holes, and she would lie in them and look so happy and really comfortable and reconfigure it every day. And I thought it should be like that. So I wanted to figure out how to make furniture that you could just make yourself anytime you want and change it whenever you need it. And so what I figured out was that when they make foam in factories, before you go to the foam store to buy it in slabs, they make these huge, huge chunks. They call them buns. And they just kind of slice them so they're square, and then they cut them up into slices that they sell at the store, like bread. And so I bought a whole bunch of these directly from the manufacturer. And I was pretty sure that I needed to carve them with a chainsaw. Later I found out that wasn't true. You can carve them with like a turkey carving knife, but the chainsaw seemed to, in my mind, and the only person who I called who was willing to carve foam for me with a chainsaw was Bob Clark, who was a special effects carver from Hollywood. So Bob came out and we bought all this foam, and we'd go in there and we'd carve it every day, and I would smooth it using like a body grinder for a car, and he'd carve with the chainsaw, and we'd just get on it and see how it felt. I have a picture of him taking a break. And then we made this, which was really great. And so this is like, okay, so I tell this one other story about this, just to explain the naked electrician on there. So this was just staged for the photo. This is Andrea Rosen and one of her gallery assistants back then, and somehow she got her electrician to take off his clothes and get in the rock. But what it's alluding to is a phenomenon that happened at the opening. So basically what happened with this piece is that, contrary to what everyone thinks, galleries don't always they hardly ever pay production. Maybe they do now, but this was not my experience for years and years. And so I had to take a personal loan from a collector who I was friendly with of $18,000 to pay for this piece. And so the idea was that I would sell the piece and pay him back. And so I really wanted, and people kind of get angry when they can't get on my work sometimes, so I wanted people to look at the work and to covet it and think, oh, it looks so comfortable, I want to get on it, but I'm not going to get on it. But I could, but I won't. And so the only way I could think of doing that was by putting naked people on it, because I never want to go near naked people. So I thought that would show that it's comfortable, it's natural, but it will keep everyone off of it. And so I found a couple of people who are willing to do that, to hang out on it at the opening. And to get them a little bit more relaxed, we gave them champagne. So they drank a lot of the champagne, and then about halfway through the opening, they were super drunk, and then their friends came in and saw them having so much fun, so their friends took off their clothes and got on it too. And this is anyway, and so it just ended up being this big mess, because of course they got completely torn up. And they were not something that you would be able to sell. And so I ended up finally resolving it. They were in a show at the Pompidou in Paris, and they paid enough of a production fee that I was able to finally pay off my debt, which I'd also been slowly paying off in other ways. But it's just like, I feel like sometimes the stories that happen behind these are so much better than the reality of what you would ever see when you go to a gallery. Okay, so by the late 1990s, I was beginning to travel and exhibit a lot internationally, and I was having all these questions about art's function as an export commodity. You know, I think everyone kind of takes that for granted now, but for me, it was really a shock. to realize that when you like you're a California artist, I was making work that's very American, very West Coast, and yet when you show this in Europe, they have no idea what all these references are, and they're very reference heavy, and so much was lost in the translation between culture and context. And I've also done a lot of thinking and writing about what I refer to as an intimate audience. So what I wanted was, rather than trying to spread my work around the world and diluting it in my mind, I was interested in deliberately focusing my energies in a smaller community where I could have a more concentrated and tangible effect. I moved to Joshua Tree, California to start an experimental testing grounds for my work called A to Z West. And so the idea was to create one site, kind of like A to Z East, where my work, where I would conceive it, create it, and the viewing would all happen in one location. And there's a lot of other reasons for this area too. It was incredibly cheap. I was able to get my house, which was like the nicest house that I looked at, on 5 acres for $40,000. And situations like that still exist now, although not as many. And it was cheap. It was 2.5 hours from LA, so I had this idea that people would still come see me if they were interested enough in the work. And my family is from right south of here, so I was actually very familiar. This was like my culture, so it was nice going home after being in New York. In New York, I always felt like a transplant or like one of the gentrifiers, and here I just felt like I could be part of this community, even though they think I'm weird. But everyone's kind of weird out there, so it's okay. This was the house was an original homestead cabin built in the 1940s. The Homestead Act is a super interesting thing, but I'm going to skip it right now just so I have room to talk about other things. And the furniture in the house kind of evolved from my practice. This was kind of just like A to Z East. So the kitchen didn't have the usual appliances. As I think I've already mentioned, I hate to cook. So I was trying to figure out a way. I figured my hatred of cooking is all about performance anxiety. And so let's see if I have a better picture of it. Yeah. So I just put a grill in the middle of the table, and for like a year, I just made veggie burgers. And so people came over, we would both cook our veggie burgers on the grill for ourselves and then eat them out of these indentations on the table. And later, I think I switched to tacos, which I still am very fond of because you can just change all the ingredients constantly and keep them in bowls in the refrigerator and pull them out. So it's kind of one of those glorious inventions. And I'm still thinking a lot about the ideology of raw and trying to figure out different ways of manifesting this as a design idea. So this was another iteration of raw furniture, but I made it with these cubes that could be carved. You can get this extension. They're illegal in the state of California, but this extension for an angle grinder from King Arthur's tools called the Sir Lancelot, and it's basically a chainsaw extension for an angle grinder, and you can carve anything with it. And then this was another version where I started carving the foam myself. Oh, wow. Okay, and so there's this really huge part of A to Z West now that I'm not going to talk about in the talk, just because there's so little time. There's going to be a question and answers afterwards, so we can do that. But I will say, so this is the wagon station encampment. We have 12 of these now, and there's a couple of different ways that people can visit, but one thing we have is the encampment, and it's open for about a month in the spring and a month in the fall, and people can apply to come do residencies and stay in these in the desert. There's information on my website. And gosh, it's so weird not talking about those at all. But anyway, I might circle back if there's time. So I've been in the desert for 16 years, and I'm just going to show you kind of an overview of some of the shifts in my practice. One of the things that I started to pay more attention, later in my practice, is just the way that things are made, how this becomes part of the conceptual makeup. And I think the uniforms are a good example of that too, where I was talking about the single strand and the felt. But when I moved to A to Z West, there was this challenge to come up with a new way of making things that made more sense in the desert. in the beginning, we couldn't just like run out and buy plywood. And my studio was outside originally, and I worked with a lot of steel. And if you try and touch steel in the summer heat, you can literally just like blister your hands. I also had this idea that I would figure out a way of making work that was easier, which everyone laughs at now when I tell them that, because the easier you think something will be, the more difficult it actually ends up being. And I was trying to think, well, what are the most plentiful natural resources out here that I can make work out of? And I realized that because I had to take everything to the dump myself, and because, especially in the beginning, everything was done by mail order, so I had all these mail order catalogs coming in that, like, actually my waste was my biggest plentiful natural resource, my paper waste. So I started experimenting with paper pulp as the material. And so they're dried, the paper pulp panels are dried in a grid of racks called the regenerating field. People think that they look like solar panels or modernist sculpture, but I often imagine that they're like an agricultural field. And I like this idea that I can farm my art by setting out a batch of pulp paper each day and then harvesting it several weeks later when it's dry. The original title for this work was, something from nothing with very little effort involved. And then the guy who was my assistant just started laughing at me. He's like, because it would take us a day. We would pulp this in a blender, and it would take like a whole day just to make enough pulp to fill one of these trays. And this is what they look like when they're done. They kind of look like terrazzo. You could see little bits of the paper pulp in them. Another body of work that happened quite a bit later, but I think they're very similar and directly related to this process, is the aggregated stacks. Because so many of the things that we have to be ordered and delivered, there's just this constant stream of boxes coming into the house, and it always seems like a shame to throw them out, especially if they're like really nice proportions, or they're still crisp on the edges. And so I started holding on to all the really good boxes, and my house was being kind of renovated, like changed at the time, and I just started putting all the boxes on this wall, stacking them up, and I had some future idea that bookshelves would go on those walls. And then at one point I realized that if I experimented with materials, I could probably figure out a way to actually turn the boxes into shelves. So that has now segued kind of into this body of work that I'm actually quite fond of. This is a show I did of them in a gallery in Berlin. And while I started doing this work, I've been thinking a lot about this idea of a decomposing grid. I think that as humans, we aspire toward the orderly and the systematic, which is represented by the grid. Things like schedules, financial sheets, or architecture is always based on the grid. But if you think about the reality of life itself, like, the reality of human imperfection, I think that this decomposing or fractured grid is probably a better example of the reality of what happens to our aspirations. And then the most recent body of work that I wanted to talk to you about also connects to pieces that I did really early on when I was just starting my practice. And this is actually now kind of what I'm coming back to again. In the early 1990s, I began to explore these elemental forms that could slip between functional categories and social roles, depending on just really simple shifts or like value systems. So I think a lot about a flat plane. So a plane can be a painting when you hang it on the wall. It can be a carpet when you put it on the floor, or a shelter when you put it on a frame, or a garment when you put it on the human form. This is like a good example of a panel, and these are the A to Z carpet furniture. I actually started this series in the 90s, and this is a more recent one that I did. There's a cabin near me that I've always wanted to buy, and I've still been unsuccessful. But I made this in hopes that, trying to figure out if this slide, I guess it looks kind of crooked from where I'm standing. Anyway, it looks disorienting from where I'm standing. But anyway, so I made this. It was like, I thought, if I could ever buy that cabin, this is what would go in it. So the way that it works is that the carpet furniture consists of, it has the footprints of the various furniture imprinted on it. So these are both sort of represented, and they can literally serve the functions. Like she's lying on the bed, that's a carpet that's next to it. That black thing is a dresser with a chair next to it. This is another carpet with a table, placemats, 2 chairs, and this is the kitchen counter back there. And then, so then when you don't need the room anymore, you can hang it on the wall and it returns to being a representation of a space instead of a literal space. I kind of put this in because it leads to the next piece, but this is Donald Judd's work. And I was going, he has this really wonderful space on Spring Street. And I went by this piece once, and it's just stuck in my mind ever since. I felt like Donald Judd had kind of done everything that I wanted to do with my work with this one singular piece. But I really love this because it looks like a table, but it's only 17 inches high, which is the height of a seat, so it would connote that you would sit on it. And it has a Persian carpet on it, which makes it feel like a floor. And the title of it is Bench. So I was just always really obsessed with that piece. And eventually I ended up making my own version of it in my home to see I always wondered, like, would this really work? And in reality, like, I like Judd's piece. I think that the Persian carpet, like, conceptually is so succinct. And I tried a carpet like that originally, and it was actually not uncomfortable, and no one sat on it. And then I ended up modifying it, customizing it with these cushions, and now it gets used. And I've also started working with textiles a lot, or more specifically hand-woven tapestries, because they're just interesting to the way they bridge so many functions, which I've already spoken about a bit. This is our weaving studio. At Izzy West, we now have 5 looms, and different people come in and use it. So I use it for my practice when I need it, and then when I don't need it, we make it available to other people. So this is a good example of that work. So in this installation, I was thinking about literal objects versus representational ones. So the top work is this painting of a panel on an actual panel. So it's like a representation and a literal object. The hand-woven textile that's been folded, so it's both 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional at the same time. And the gouache painting is both an abstraction as well as a diagram. And then I just was going to quickly show you this because I do a lot of pieces that deal with sort of rule sets. Oops. When I did these, I wanted their design to be tied to a kind of logic. Because I was working with a 60-inch weaving, I worked with a lot of different weavers all over the country because we were on a short time frame. And so we found different people with 60-inch looms, and I would mail them a script, almost like a score for a dance. And so they would just follow the score, but however they wanted. And so these were all done with the same set of instructions. So it's almost like having software where it controls the way that it looks, but each one is different. So like an example would be like start with a black stripe that touches both the left and the right side of the blanket. The stripe can be as thick as you want. And then it goes on with like the series of instructions. And I really like pieces like that. And then ultimately, when you talk about horizontal, and I feel like I've been doing this a lot, this talk, for some reason. I've been like, my mouth is not working perfectly. In vertical planes, you're talking about the building blocks of architecture and spaces that you can inhabit with your body. So this is where I'm at now. This is not recent work. This is from 2 years ago, but I've been thinking about this a lot, and how these create literal reality fields for your body. This was a piece that was in Denver, and it was a whole series of these identical sort of units that I wanted them to feel kind of like a brutalist apartment complex, but because they're facing different directions, there's some faceting that happens. And then this is the most recent manifestation that happened in Belgium. But what I'm going to do now, okay, so this is like, I'm at the very end of my talk. I have a very, very short, it's less than 5-minute PowerPoint. I'm going to end this on exactly an hour. And then I think, when we're done, then we can go in the other room to do questions and answers. So. Thank you. Great. Okay, so from what I understand, we're going to go to a different room, which I guess you guys probably all know where we're going if anyone has questions. And thank you very much. Oops. Okay, thank you.